The Competition Tribunal is currently hearing the case of where SA Airlink is accused of anti-competitive conduct through alleged price-fixing practices. So at the heart of the proceedings is a critical question. Did SA Airlink use its market dominance to manipulate pricing in a way that ultimately hurts South African consumers? So this case is not just about penalties or corporate conduct, but it seeks a fair, transparent and competitive aviation sector that of course serves the needs of everyday South African travellers with far-reaching consequences as well for affordability, for access and economic mobility. Let's unpack this further. Independent analyst Khaya Sithole is going to be weighing in. Khaya, good morning. Thanks for your time with us here on the SABC at this hour.
Good morning and good morning to the viewers.
Perhaps for context's sake, you could paint the picture on what specific pricing behaviors or agreements is SA Airlink being accused of? I mean, is it alleged collusion with competitors? Is it abuse of dominance? Is it predatory pricing? Particularly on the thin routes as well. Perhaps you could paint that picture for us.
So the starting point is to acknowledge the very difficult circumstances under which the aviation industry in South Africa is structured. So there are the big airports that you and I probably generally use, or Tambo in Cape Town. Everybody can access those because there's enough people that travel on those routes for everyone to believe that they can have a share of the pie. What happened to the smaller airports and the less frequent routes is that very few airlines think it's economically viable to actually service those particular routes. So you'll find that one or two may then decide that, look, we think that there is an opportunity for us to capitalize by servicing that particular route. And obviously, if we're the only ones that are doing so, we will be in a position to essentially determine what the market prices are at any point in time. The Umtata route is one of those where there was only just one big airline, Airlink, that was servicing it. And of course, because there was no competition, they could essentially decide at a drop of a hat what the price was going to be. What we then saw is that there was another competitor that said, look, we think there's also an opportunity to participate in that market, so therefore want to enter that market. But when that new airline, which was Blue Crane, entered that market, suddenly Airlink discovered a formula of charging a bit less than what they used to do so before. And when they persisted with their now lower prices, it then turned out that the new entrant said that, well, we are in the market, we're operating the market, but because Airlink is charging so much lower than we are, everybody books on them and they don't book on our flights. So therefore, that new airline could not survive. So the distinction here is that before the entry of the new airline, there was a particular pricing regime, and obviously the evidence can show what the average ticket prices were at that particular point in time. And then you've got that period in which there is a secondary player that says we also want to be in the market, and then suddenly there's a new pricing regime that is being practiced by Airlink, and again, the evidence can show what the average prices were at that particular point in time. So it is in that distinction between the pre-entry versus the incumbency of the secondary player where the case lies, where Airlink has to explain why their pricing methodology turned out particular rates at a particular point in time, and then why suddenly, when there was a new player, suddenly they found a way of charging a bit differently. So of course, if it turns out that they were charging much less in order to ensure that the other airline collapsed, then that is essentially the problem statement that the Competition Tribunal has to then say, why did you do that?
Khaya, thank you for explaining that to us in layman's terms. It's so important because we're actually also looking at the consequences at large. And why does this matter for consumers and regional connectivity? I'm asking because we're trying to ascertain whether these practices could have reduced choice and increased prices in the long run. But also, how might the rural and underserved regions also be disproportionately affected at that point? How would you weigh in on that front?
The problem with those that exploit an advantage that is based on the fact that they're the only primary player there or the most dominant player out there is that it actually capitalizes on the desperation of those that do want to use that particular service. So of course, if you are based in Umtata and you do have a business that requires you to continuously travel to Johannesburg, you are actually dependent on using just this airline. And in fact, it was one of the business executives that was based in Umtata that was traveling frequently to Johannesburg who was one of those that raised the alarm and said, I don't think that the pricing makes sense here. So naturally, if there is a particular dynamic where a particular route is only serviced by one role player, and that role player is able to determine what the prices are on the market, and they can then decide what the profit margins are going to be, it inevitably means that those that are dependent on that route are at the mercy of that particular market participant. And if that market participant see this as a lucrative way of generating what we may refer to as excessive profits, then they will continue to do so. it is always a question of whether anyone can identify that there is indeed something strange about that pricing and then elevate a case to the tribunal to say, could you please look into this? And I think what helps with this particular case is that there's a very clear time frame before the entry of a new player versus the time frame when there was a new player, and also the third time frame, which is what happened after that second role player exited the market on the assumption that it said that it couldn't sustain its operations because of the pricing model that Airlink was practicing there. So there are indeed definitely economic consequences across the value chain, not just for the passengers that will be using that airline or that route at a particular point in time, but also for those other complementary services that would benefit from the existence of a much wider network servicing the Umtata route, for example.
Okay, so then, Khaya, if we're looking at the precedents that this case could then set for the aviation industry at large in South Africa, what comes to mind? Does this also strengthen regulatory oversight in other transport sectors, perhaps even give newer, smaller entrants a better chance to compete as well?
Not necessarily. The difficulty here is that whatever the ruling that emerges from a case of this nature is not going to change the economics of trying to open a route in the smaller areas and in the low volume areas, low foot traffic areas. And the reality here is that generally what those airports tend to be is that they tend to be smaller in size, which means that you can't just take the flight that you use for your Joburg and Cape Town route and say we're now going to use it to service that much smaller airport. There may be size dimensions associated with that. And there's also the question of, well, will you ever have enough passengers to actually justify using that big aircraft? So if you're an airline that doesn't have like a fleet of smaller aircraft that can service those, you're simply not going to entertain that market in the first place. And even those that do decide to enter that market, then it's a question of, well, given the capital costs associated with opening an airline and making sure that you reach profitability, there will be a point in time where the prices that get charged are simply aimed at making sure that we reach some element of break even, whilst at the same time we become appealing enough to them market at large so that people know that they can use us as an alternative. Now, the question of how long it takes to get them and how much it costs to get them is what every single role player in the airline industry would have to apply their minds to. And generally, the answer is that we simply don't have the capital or the patience or the appetite to even service those routes. So we do still see that those smaller communities and those smaller towns are still underserviced on the basis that the economics of putting an airline together and running it efficiently are quite simply very difficult in the South African market in particular.
Sure. Khaya, thank you for clarifying that as well. I think just as we wrap up, looking at possibilities and probabilities, if SA Airlink is found guilty, what's the recourse? What are the remedies? What are the penalties that could be applied? How would they then ultimately benefit consumers? Will fines go towards consumers, redressing, that broader competition issue as well?
Yeah. Look, given how long this has been pending, I mean, the case is over 10 years old, there's absolutely no way that anyone is going to then say we found that the effect of your excessive pricing or your predatory pricing was a particular amount, and this was the customer that suffered the harm. There's simply just not going to be a process of that nature. So if there is indeed going to be a penalty regime, it will follow the normal protocols of what the competition authorities do when they do find that a market participant has been guilty of dodgy conduct. So they will then say, this is the turnover base penalty, if that is the case. And once that particular role player then pays the penalty, then it will go into the fund that the competition regulators then will determine how it is to be allocated and distributed following their own processes. But it's unfortunately not going to come back to the consumer. It's simply impractical to do so. But what this might do is that it might create an additional sense of vigilance amongst those that operate in the aviation sector to say, look, the authorities are watching you, and there is no time limits to how long they can go back and revisit the type of things that you've been saying, that you've been doing in conducting your businesses.
Khaya, I don't know if you've had time to actually tune into the tribunal, the hearings, but if you're looking at the style, the structure, I mean, we saw the financial and economic witnesses that were coming through. Well, what's your take on the fairness of the questioning and the procedural approaches that have been undertaken to date?
Well, I mean, it is as robust as it needs to be. And what you really are trying to understand here is that when you're interrogating the witness that represents an airline, naturally, they are going to try and position it as, this was normal conduct. We're simply conducting our businesses in the way that we saw fit. There was absolutely nothing untoward about it. So you do have to try and extract a lot of, additional insights, even from one whose position is that, look, we actually don't think that anything went wrong here. So I think it is as robust as it can get. and hopefully once the tribunal then applies its mind and issues a ruling, it will be able to explain to everyone else what it is that they considered, having heard the evidence and having looked at all the data that underpins this case, and then give us a ruling that everybody can say, now we understand how it all works.
Well, Khaya, I know that commission continues, or that tribunal continues Monday and Tuesday. Thank you for your time. Let's leave it there for making sense of really what has transpired. I know lots of time has passed, but obviously we're trying to ascertain really where to from here, right? With this SA Airlink case, a test perhaps on how robust South Africa's competition laws are in protecting the public from exploitative market behavior. Let's see what unfolds from there. Independent analyst Khaya Sithole weighing in on why SA Airlink's tribunal matters for travelers alike in South Africa. Thank you again to him for joining us at this hour.